Our guest this week is Peter Everington. He's from Initiatives of Change, otherwise known as Moral Rearmament, and he spent much of his life living and working in the Middle East, particularly in the Sudan. So welcome to the English Hour on ANN Satellite Television. It's a privilege to be here again with you. Our guest today is Peter Everington. Peter is, well, he's from Initiatives of Change, an organisation better known in the Middle East as Moral Rearmament, and one we've come across before here on ANN. We'll be discussing the Sudan. We'll be discussing, because Peter has worked extensively in the Sudan, we'll be discussing the whole issue of Islam and how the West views Islam, which is obviously very key to us at the moment. We'll also be discussing the movement to which he's given his life, Moral Rearmament, so we'll address that as well. But first, Peter, welcome to ANN Television. It's really good to have you with us. Thank you so much for being our guest. What we do, we follow our practice here, but we'll go to a short video clip and as an intro to the program, and then we'll start our discussion.
Right.
Thank you. The Islamic world and the West appear to be mired in an intensifying cycle of political and cultural conflict. The result is an atmosphere of doubt, distrust and disrespect in which efforts to dominate and coerce adversaries displace initiatives to collaborate in a search for intellectual and intercultural understanding and means of mutual political accommodation. On both sides of the troubled relationship between the West and the Muslim Middle East, there is deep estrangement and a growing belief in the futility of communication. Education is an obviously valuable resource for any nation, but it is particularly so for developing countries and for those hoping to escape the cycle of violence and despotism that plagues much of Africa. In the case of Sudan, the history of its educational system mirrors the story of the country's painful transition to independence, its violent attempts to forge a common national identity, and its decades of war and military rule. Sadly, this history is also a story of missed opportunity, inequitable policies, and a self-reinforcing tendency to manipulate higher education as a proxy for a real political process. The moral and spiritual rearmament movement was founded in 1938 when the world was feverishly preparing for war by rearming to the utmost. Its adherents hoped that the world would avoid war if individuals experienced a moral and spiritual awakening. Following World War II, moral rearmament retains some influence in countries such as Egypt, Sudan, and Lebanon, where it emphasizes a contemplative approach to listening to God and cooperation, honesty, and mutual respect between opposing groups. Well, Peter, so thank you. You tell us, you joined Moral Rearmament years ago and then felt the call to go to Sudan. Tell us a little bit about how that happened.
Well, I was a university student at the time of decolonization, but also at the time that many may remember at Suez, 1956, when Britain invaded Egypt.
Yes, yes.
And I was very naive, really ignorant about the world. But starting at university, I found I fell into natural friendships with people from Africa and the Arab world, and began to realize what they felt about the British Empire, and particularly, of course, about this invasion by the government of Egypt in 1956. And so I sort of counted myself religious. I wanted to have a sort of religious kind of life, but I was very troubled about the state of the world, and I didn't see how the state of the world and faith matched.
Yeah, much as today, yes, yes, indeed.
And so, okay, you to change the world, you need to change yourself first, and I was having a go at that. So that was character, but then comes career.
Yes.
And somebody said, well, you can either say, I have a plan for my career, and God has a part, or you can say, God has a plan for the world, and I have a part
Okay.
in his plan.
Yes.
So as I went away in silence to meditate on what I should do with my life, I suddenly had the thought, what is really needed in the world is a new bridge of trust built between Britain and the Arab world, which was awful at that time. And my part could be to use my language gift to switch my studies to Arabic, my last year at university. And Father was dismayed with this and said, what the hell are you going to do with a subject like that?
Yes.
And then towards the end of my last year, I somehow got an introduction to the Sudan ambassador in London. This was 2 years after their independence. And he said, we want British people to teach English in our secondary schools. How about it? So I came for interview, and 3 months later landed in Khartoum with a contract to teach English for the next 5 years.
Wow.
And stayed for 8. So that's how it started.
Wonderful, wonderful. And it's been a lifetime association with Sudan and with the Arab world.
With the Arab world. I mean, it started with the sense of a need for Britain to make restitution to wrong things we'd done in the Arab world. I think we've done some right things as well, but there were wrong things, and a new course needed to be set. This is in the kind of evening of empire, really. And people of our generation, you know, it was up to us to build something new.
And you see the way things have gone now. I mean, your heart filled with hope or despair? I mean, it's a...
Well, I think that God still exists, and he still has a calling for people who want to be peacemakers.
Yes.
And I see evidence of that happening in younger generations. So I take heart from that. And even though the situation looks as impossible today, perhaps as it looked impossible to me at that time, I think that there are answers to be found, and anybody can find a part who feels deeply about it.
Before we talk about Sudan, before we talk about Moral Riyama, let's just talk a bit about perhaps the first of our subjects, Islam.
Yes.
Because, I mean, maybe that would be a good overview, if you like, of...
Yes.
You were saying that you wanted to discuss the Western attitude to Islam.
Or Western approach to Islam, yes.
And what is your... I mean, you are... Obviously, we have a long history of a relationship, but we don't really understand Islam, I guess. I mean, what is your feeling about the way, how we relate to the Arab world and to the Muslim world? I mean...
Today, you mean? Today?
Yes.
Well, it's so easy just to pick up the stereotypes which are served to us, and of course there is truth in them. So I think there's just a big work to be done by convinced individuals for a start. And I take that approach to be, first of all, you start with what there is to appreciate and what there is to learn from. Can I give an instance of that, or should I?
Yeah, please do, yes.
A very good Sudanese friend of mine later he was a teacher of history, went to work in Qatar, where I met him again after many years. And his son was about to go back to study in the United States. And it was not long after the bombings in America.
Yeah, 9/11.
9/11, yes. And a very sort of nervy time for an Arab student to go back into America with all the checks, which of course needed to be done, and an anxious time for the father. And so the son went off, and then he rang from the airport, and father said to him, Rabbana yuwasalak bil afiyah. May God cause you to arrive in good shape. And I thought, what a wonderful, natural thing for a father to say to a son in any endeavor, in any culture. May the Lord cause you to arrive safely.
Yes. Yes.
And what a wonderful instinct, and not to be taken for granted in our more secularized society in the West, that we do rely on God for our security and our eternal life, and just a respect for Muslims who are bringing up their children in that spirit.
And you feel we kind of lack that respect that we should have?
Well, I don't want to generalize, because I feel that does exist very widely in people I know. But I think it puts us on a level playing ground if, as Christian parents, Muslim parents, Jewish, whatever, we're trying to bring up our children in what the Bible calls love, joy, peace, faithfulness, generosity, self-control. And these seem to be the values that Muslim parents, at their best, try to bring up their children.
And our attitude to Islam, I mean, what is your personal attitude to Islam? You obviously have great respect for Islam.
Yes, well, in my Arabic studies at university in my last year, I studied the Quran, from scratch, 5 surahs, and I came across phrases which stood out for me as something of eternal truth and universal truth. Don't take me for an expert on the Quran, I'm not. But when you read, Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, guide us on the straight path, what a wonderful prayer. And when you hear, let me get this right, وَلَا تَكُلَنَّ لِشَيْءٍ إِنِّي فَاعِلٌ ذَلِكَ غَدًا إِلَّا أَنْ يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ وَاذْكُرْ رَبَّكَ إِذَا نَسِيتَ وَقُلْ عَسَىٰ أَنْ يَهْدِيَنِي رَبِّي لِأَقْرَبَ مِنْ هَذَا رَشَدًا, which, if I may attempt to translate, don't say about anything you're going to do unless you also say, if God wills, and remember your Lord if you have forgotten him, and say, perhaps God will guide me to something closer to his guidance. What a wonderful concept, that we're in a lifelong search for the will of God. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we get it wrong, but there's the assurance that there is a gift of somehow getting closer. So that's prayers, verses from our holy books that we can share.
Interesting. Tell me, I mean, there is an Omani friend of mine. Your Arabic is good, my Arabic is atrocious. He had this expression, I'm going to pronounce it completely wrong. Ya'esh wa atrak gairak ya'esh. Live and let the others live. I don't know how it should be pronounced in Arabic, but anyway, I've clearly got it badly wrong. But the point is, this should be our attitude to Islam and Islam's attitude to us. I mean, I think in Surah 109 of the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad says that, or God says that, you must allow the others to live as they wish, and we don't actually. Neither. I mean, if you look now at the Muslim world, we are very concerned in the West about ISIS, who have kind of a takfiri approach to us. But then we don't. I mean, we have interfered repeatedly and militarily in the Middle East, and not always successfully, not always I don't know. I mean, it's questionable sometimes, some of our actions. There's a lack of willingness to let the others get on with their lives, wouldn't you say, or is that unfair?
I think in answering this, I'm going back to the previous sequence of the approach to the Muslim world, because I think step 2 is looking at where you have been wrong from your side. And I think both sides have to do this.
Interesting, yes.
And from my, and not just sort of parking it all on the politicians in this country or other countries.
True. I mean, we elect them after all.
Yes. And because I had to face, round about that time, that I was first meeting Arabs, that I had been a very domineering character towards someone in my family, and given him a hard time. And part of life was to recognize that. At the same time, I thought I was more Christian than him in a comic way. But so part of life for me was to go to him and say, look, I'm sorry for being domineering. You've got to increase in importance. I need to decrease in importance. And this, and people say, as I am, so is my nation. So then when you start to be absolutely honest about your nation, then you see, all right, I believe Britain has sent some good people and done many good things in the world, but sometimes we have been a domineering elder uncle towards less advantaged people at the time, and we need to get into a mode of partnership, service, respect. So this is what I sort of brought into the shame about Suez, that my government had behaved rather like I had behaved in my family. And if I could change, then perhaps my country also could change in its attitude to other countries.
Inspiring. It's very hard to be humble, isn't it? It's very hard to... I mean, very hard to actually admit that you are wrong.
Especially if you feel you're very religious already. I think we're the most difficult people.
Yes, yes, of course. It's let's come to, I mean, in the context of Islam today, we have very difficult relationship with Islam today in the West. You feel that if we could change our hearts, then this would change this whole relationship, and it starts at a personal level. That's what you're saying.
I think so, yes. I feel sometimes when, in my experience, when Muslims see an act of kindness by a person of another religion, Christian for instance, they'll say, "Shuf al-insaniya kayf." Look at the humanity of that. And I think Muslims as well as Christians believe that Christ was the example of perfect humanity.
Yes.
And if we can somehow manage to live in his way and admit where we failed to live that way, then it's not so much a policy or a statement or words. It's an attitude which is open to us, and thereby I think to challenge Muslims where needed to live the best they know.
Inspirational. That is really a powerful thought. Tell me, because we must talk about your experience in Sudan. I mean, a beloved country. I went there often as a young man when Numeri was in power, and Joseph Lagu was vice president.
Yes.
Indeed, once on one occasion, disastrously, we took a football team, and we underestimated the power of Sudanese football. They were so good, they just thrashed the British. But Sudan, in that, it was almost a golden age. They'd had a terrible civil war, and there was a kind of a peace. And Sudan was one nation. didn't last, sadly. In the last year or so of New Mary, things went sour and things fell apart. But we had that window of a lovely time in Sudan, time of peace. We haven't seen its like since, really. And currently, even after the partition of Sudan into north and south, we still see civil war within the north, we see civil war within the south, and we see tensions between the north and the south. I mean, this poor country, one of the most magnificent countries in the world, is just riven with factional war. For what? And we have meddled, the British have meddled. You worked there for 8 years, and I know you love Sudan very much. You taught many of the people who came into government in due course.
Some, yes.
Your heart for Sudan, well, your heart must be broken about the way it is now. What are it's hard to ask your reflections about the way forward there, but there obviously is a way out of this mess for Sudan, isn't there? I mean, there is a way forward. Do you have any reflections, not necessarily about that, but about Sudan in general you'd like to share with us?
Well, first of all, I count myself an educated rather than a political analyst.
Of course, I'm being unfair.
Well, no, you ask whatever you will, but I can only answer to ability. And so I would say I'm part of the people-to-people relationship between Britain and Sudan, rather than the sort of government-level political comprehension. So it is a great sorrow, a very great sorrow.
Of course it is.
And yet you feel in history, in seemingly impossible situations, a person or a group of people arise with an idea who look completely insignificant at the time, in the middle of the chaos going on, who turn out to be the nucleus of an answer. And so I don't know whether to pray for a Gandhi or a Mandela to be there, or a group of Gandhis or Mandelas in these different countries. But I feel that in a way, both Sudan and South Sudan have politically obtained their heart's desire. Sudan as a whole obtained independence from Britain 59 years ago, whatever it is. And South Sudan 4 years ago obtained its heart's desire of political independence from the north. And I think the lesson that bears in on us all, as we know very well in our scarred British and European history, that independence or the coming to power of a new group isn't the end in itself. It may be an important step, but it calls for a deeper spirit of citizenship to carry all elements of the new society which you have striven for. And so I think that crisis in Sudan and South Sudan will force more and more people to look more deeply inside for the moral and spiritual elements of governance and independence. And I do see signs of that too, and I see signs of the capacity for it. Because when you've been in a struggle for independence, freedom, your whole energy has got into that. And I think that often people don't ask themselves, supposing I win, what are going to be the values which govern the new society I desire, and how do I now, in the midst of my struggle, set about teaching my children and the children of the country the values I want to prevail in the new society.
It's very important because yes, people seek power, and they almost seek power for itself, and they don't have a true set of ideals to carry them through once they achieve power.
One of my former students, himself a politician, gave me an Arabic saying, آخر ما يخرج من قلب العبد حب السلطة, which is being interpreted, the last thing to depart from the heart of a servant of God is the love of power.
So true.
And hear a politician saying that.
Yes.
And when I went back on a visit to Sudan last September, I reminded him of that, and he said, yes, I well remember saying that to you. So I think, again, this is not the politicians, it's teachers can love power, maybe even journalists can love power.
Yes.
We all have to search our hearts on that one.
Absolutely.
On the sort of politics and society of inclusion.
So power, yes. And of course we have Lord Acton's maxim, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes.
For us here in the West, we have to always remember that. Yes. But there is a difference. I mean, there's a desire for power, but there's sometimes a desire for power in order that we can make a difference. And I guess if we can keep that star in our thought, and that we want to actually do something to make this world a better world, then seeking. Actually, we shouldn't seek power. We should seek to make a difference, shouldn't we? That should be the objective, rather than seeking some sort of dominion over the other person. But dear Sudan, you went back. You saw many of your old friends, who were very glad, no doubt, to see you, but who also were facing this time of crisis. They have despair in their hearts, I suppose, many of them, or are they positive?
Well, one of them said to me, it is no longer a question of politics and religion, as it was. The big issue now, said he, is religion and morality.
Really?
So that's what I read into what he said, was that he realized that his country asserted its Muslim identity, but wasn't very successful in the work out of it, in terms of the corruption that was going on and unscrupulous behavior in certain areas. And he was lamenting that, and I think perhaps chastising himself to some degree, but feeling that that was the need. And I think perhaps he was looking at the wider Muslim world and the wider world, full stop, religion and morality.
Although, well, yes, and has religion been Sudan's problem? It's not. You don't see religion as the problem and not just in Sudan, but in the wider world. If you look at the much of the tension in Iran is between people of different faiths, streams of faith, belief systems, and if not that, of course, they're within. I mean, in the south, you get the Christians fighting the Christians, so it's not strictly fair. But there is this interreligious element to the fighting.
Yes, I'm coming back to Sudan and the comparison. Sometimes my students used to say, the boys at the secondary school where I taught, "Sir, what is the difference between us and boys in Britain?" So I worked out an answer to that, which was Britain is a cold country and boys fall off their bicycles by going too fast. Sudan is a hot country and people fall off their bicycles by going too slowly.
Yes.
But then I went on to say when it comes to issues of morality, for instance, absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, absolute love, how we're supposed to live, British students, certainly when I was at university, would say, philosophically, there's no such thing as an absolute moral standard. Therefore, I don't need to bother about them too much. Whereas the Sudanese Muslim would say, absolute moral standards, of course, they are all in our holy books. So of course we live them. But they still fall off the bicycle.
Yes, yes.
And I think we all need to look at, why we fall off the bicycle, where we fail in the living of the thing which we're supposed to believe, and what we do about that. And I think we can generate some humility within ourselves and between each other in that process.
Well, let's talk. Sorry.
And then I think when we're really honest, not just about what we believe, but how we live, then we can find constructive ways forward. That's what I've found.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because this is, I mean, it's not uniquely your approach to life. It's one that resonates for everybody, I imagine. But you have adhered to the movement that we call moral rearmament. In Arabic, just remind me.
التسلح الخلقي.
Okay. At-Tasallih al-Hulaki.
Al-Khulaqi.
Al-Khulaqi. I will never get that right. But so this movement is founded on these principles: absolute love, absolute honesty, absolute purity, and absolute selflessness. Taking those last two, because they're the most controversial in a way. I mean, every Muslim in the world can understand absolute honesty, and every Christian also. Whether they practice it is another matter. Every Christian, every Muslim, everybody of any faith can understand absolute love. Whether they practice it is another matter. But coming down to the harder issues of selflessness and purity, I mean, selflessness is perhaps what you've been talking about right through this discussion, because it has a strong thread for a strong resonance for your life, and I think and living it is quite inspirational. It's also helpful, I think, to live a life of selflessness, because it's personally empowering, because it removes fear, I would say. Fear of death, fear of failure, because fear of failure is the great male disease. I think women always have a great problem with guilt. Us men have a huge problem with fear of failure. That's my belief, anyway. And so it is. Perhaps it's terribly sexist. I'll be criticized by my wife later. But anyway, it is the issue of the day. If we want to free ourselves from many of the despairs that drag us down, we can do so. It's one way to lift ourselves out is through selflessness. I mean, I don't know whether that's what you mean by that, but that's what I would see in that.
Not sure I know how to answer that, but as you spoke, I was thinking of a South Sudanese politician in my day who I knew very well, and who had got addicted to alcohol and neglected his family.
Yes.
And anyway, he hated the Arab Northern Sudanese, and he'd become a member of parliament and a government minister in the national government. And then he saw one of the films of moral rearmament called Freedom, made by Africans, which dramatizes the concept of unselfishness in political life as well as domestic life. And he came to a conference where he met fellow Africans putting this into practice. And I remember the day when he stood up in front of 500 or 600 people and apologized to the Arabs for his hate and said that he wanted to be part of an Africa which was free from hate and fear and greed and would have a message for the world. And sort of simultaneously with that, he got victory over his hate, but over his alcoholism. And he gave up alcohol and started to have evenings with his family to give them food, because he wasn't spending money on the booze, and to show this film. I was his projectionist in the garden.
Right, in those days.
And people from north and south, young people and older ones, politicians, would come to his garden. And he was one of the peacemakers you spoke of, who ended the first civil war and then laid the foundations for that all too brief 11 years of peace which followed.
I think I know the politician you mean.
Yes.
But interesting. Ah, my goodness. So it does count, and it is a way that can lift you from the mire, I suppose. But what about the issue of the other issue, which is quite, I suppose, Salafist, if you like the word, the concept of purity. Now that's a tougher one, and yet I think it's one that resonates in the Arab world. I think my feeling has been, and it's why partly why I've made an effort to focus a little on moral rearmament in these broadcasts, just one or two of these broadcasts, because my feeling was that it might be a kind of alternative to the extreme ideology of ISIS that is gripping many young Muslims here in the West, or Daesh, if you like, because we've seen perhaps the best part of 2,000 have gone from Britain, 3,000 from France, and so forth, to volunteer and fight for this group. And there are causes for I mean, that we mustn't. There are reasons that Daesh has emerged on the scene, and those should be looked at. But I think many of the young Muslims who go from the West are seeking purity, are seeking a rejection of Western material values. And obviously, when we talk about purity, we focus on sexual purity, but it's much more than that. It is the actual having standards that govern your life. People here feel no sense of belonging, and they turn to go and fight for Daesh, young Muslims, because they need some sort of purity. But far better to have an idealistic approach. I mean, how do you define this concept yourself? When you obviously it's key to your belief, the idea of purity.
Purity, yes. Well, this is a tough one. I think when you start with absolute purity, and you're honest with yourself, you're horrified with your own life, and
for sure,
and your own instincts,
yes.
and there are things to put right, and you have to develop margins. Let's say if you're danger of falling over the cliff, don't walk near the edge. And you have to sort of reform your life in some way there. But purity is much more than that. Purity is a passion for what is right in the world, not just for what I want to do, but what God wants to happen in the world, what needs to happen in the world. And we all need a passion for that. And impurity is anything, however sort of harmless looking, which gets in the way of that. And the people I admire most are the people who haven't just got themselves cleaned up, which we all need to do, maybe daily, but have grasped a task which has required everything. And then I think there are two kinds of passion. One is a passion of hate, where you look on one person, one tendency, one country, like the Iranians say, Inglistan Maderi. Inglistan Maderi is Shaitana Bozorg.
That's Farsi now.
Yes, England is the mother of the great Satan, America.
Yes,
So that's placing the headquarters of impurity in a place, whereas actually I think it's in a human heart, in all human hearts. And we need a passion for what is right, based on absolute love. And I think a lot of people have got that in this country, in Arab and Muslim countries. And that is the purity to aspire to, and which is a constant challenge to me. Easily get distracted by delightful things, permissible things, some of them, but the real sort of master passion of a life, which can be a gift from God, of what you're called to do to help make a difference, as you put it, in some field of life, education, politics, the media, governance. I think that's a challenge for our society, and something that we have. It's too big, it's too impossible. Only God can give you a clean passion like that. But when you find it, you find yourself also in a comradeship with people of other cultures and other countries who you want to do it with.
Oh, bless your heart, Peter. Thank you so much. That's very powerfully said, and really thank you for being our guest on ANN. I'm very, very grateful. We haven't finished. We have a little pause. We're going to go to a small clip. Oh, well, and we'll come back to the last part of our discussion.
All right.
Thank you. So, Peter, you brought us a book that interested you, and The Power of Silence.
Yes.
Tell us about it.
Well, it is written by a British journalist and author called Graham Turner.
Oh, yes. Yes, I've met him, I think. Yes,
Have you?
indeed. Yes.
Who I respect very much. And he's sort of retirement age, but he's got hold of, I think, a very central issue for the world. How silence, the part of silence in personal life and national life and in all our life. And in these chapters, he takes us through a whole variety of religious cultures and some non-religious cultures. And for me, the most fascinating chapter is one called Better Than Bullets, which is about a small community of people in Lebanon.
Yes.
And among them was a militia leader of the so-called Christians, and another who's a militia leader of the so-called Muslims, but both of whom who now admit that they lived atrocious lives, which were a contradiction of the religion they claimed to believe in. And they both had many deaths on their hands. And as the war came to an end, they began to be ashamed and disgusted of the life they'd been living and the cost of it to society, and particularly to families. And the Christian one, Asad Shaftari is his name, made a public apology through the newspaper An-Nahar in Arabic, where he apologized to his victims and the families of his victims for what he had done, and spoke of the beginnings of a new affection for the Muslims who he had always despised. And this had an impact in the Muslim community. He had a lot of hostility from the Christians. But Mohieddin Shihab, who was Mukhtar of Ras Beirut, a kind of mayor of part of Beirut, was one of those who responded because he'd been the other militia leader. And he also came out with a public apology and restitution, some wonderful stories.
That is a wonderful story of itself.
It is, and these people are now called upon when things get especially bad. They appear on radio or television together, or they go to the flashpoint and tell their story. They're a known resource for the country. And the person who, in a way, shepherded, helped each of them separately, a man called Ramez Salami,
Oh, yes.
a Maronite lawyer,
Yes.
and he's described in these pages too. And what he did, he, as a Christian, had to make his apologies for arrogance to some of the Muslim authorities he knew. And around him grew this fellowship of people, and they start their meetings with a 20-minute period of silence.
Which is lovely.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
And at periods when they get into arguments, they talk it out, but then they're silent together. And this is beautifully described here, much better than I could describe it in this book.
Now, I do think that's a wonderful idea, and this this concept of silence, which involves an element of listening to God or to your inner voice, depending on where you're coming from.
Yes.
I mean, that is, in a sense, it's a kind of Sufi approach, but it is an approach that this meditative approach is so empowering of itself. I
Yes.
think. Yeah.
Well, it's a universal resource.
Yes.
The Mukhtar, he says, I come to my office at 7 o'clock and I lock the door and I have my quiet hour within and I seek God's guidance. Ihdina sirat al-mustaqim, guide us on the straight path. What does that mean practically in the politics and welfare and community of Beirut? And he says, then at 8 o'clock I'm ready to let the inquirers and petitioners come in and get down to work.
Wow. Well, that's really interesting. And this is The Power of Silence by Graham Turner.
Yes.
Available, no doubt, on Amazon and published by, where are we, Peter? My eyesight is getting bad in my...
Bloomsbury, is it?
Bloomsbury, is it?
Yes, Bloomsbury.
Bloomsbury. Okay, well, that is great. Bless your heart for bringing that to our attention. The Power of Silence, Graham Turner, published by Bloomsbury.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you so much again for being our guest.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's been a joy.
Thank you.
Thank you.